One. Perfect. I think we're live.
Hello.
Hey there, how are you?
I'm very well, Ryan. Yeah, how are you doing?
Great, thanks. I appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast in this run up to Christmas.
Yeah, well, it's great to take these moments to kind of take a step back from the year, and chat about the important stuff.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And Merry Christmas, by the way. I know we talked about when we were before. We talked about a bit of the plans for the next few days and a few weeks. So yeah, super exciting.
Yeah, I'm leaving the city and heading down to the west of Ireland, and then in early January I'm actually going to the Canaries. So I am going to get my first bit of winter sun ever, which I'm looking forward to.
Nice. What is it around 20 degrees this time of year, or is it a
Yeah, I think it's actually about 24, 25. My therapist recommended this very small, like little enclave in the Canaries, which is basically a microclimate and guaranteed sun. So, therapists are useful for some things.
a great recommendation?
Mm.
And I hope you don't mind me asking. We also might mention Cork as well. You're going down to Cork for a bit, and yeah.
Yeah, so going down to Bantry in West Cork. It's where my wife's family are from. So we don't get an opportunity as much as we'd like to go down there because it's a 4 hour drive, and we will be heading down. My wife is working until 4 p.m. on Christmas Eve, so we won't be down rested until about 9 p.m., I'd say, on Christmas Eve. But it's a great place to be and a very relaxing place to be, during the Christmas period.
Nice. Yeah, never been to Cork over the Christmas. So is there many things on as well? Would you be in the city or is it mainly be down in Bantry?
Yeah, I mean, West Cork is kind of a county in itself. So once you like, it's a good hour, well over an hour from Cork City to Bantry. So we will not do a huge amount, to be honest. We'll do some sea swimming because they have a sea swim every Christmas day. So it gets quite a large amount of the town. It's quite a bohemian part of Ireland. So you get a lot of kind of artists and musicians, all you know, the wildings of Ireland kind of living down there or spending like large parts of time down there. So it can be quite a creative place to be as well.
That's amazing. Are there many trad sessions in pubs or is it in houses or are there?
Yeah, like I would say trad, like there would be trad in pubs and stuff like that. I feel like the trad culture probably is more so in the west of or in the kind of Connacht parts of Ireland, but and maybe Kerry as well. But you would get a lot of yeah, just like people. It's quite a cosmopolitan area. It gets a lot of people coming from like Central Europe, Americans coming as well, having a lot of property over there. So it tends to have quite a fusion of cultures, really.
Lovely. I've noticed that there's quite a lot of people from the United States over the West and France as well, and Germany, in Achill. And I know it's a different part of the West. You have Cork, and this is mainly Connacht. But yeah, it seems like a great place to be. And maybe one day I'll spend Christmas down there and ask for some pieces of wisdom. Or yeah, but it seems like a creative space anyway over the next few weeks.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, I hope you don't mind. We get into things. I will just give a quick introduction. Feel free to interject, or if I got anything wrong, let me know. Or if you want to do it yourself, but maybe after, I'll just a bit of research. I'll talk about. For those of you who don't know, you wouldn't, but I met Dr. Dale Whelan through LinkedIn, and we got chatting on there, and we set up the podcast. We connected quite a while ago, so I'll just give a little bit of introduction. For those of you who don't know, just a bit about Dr. Dale Whelan is a behavioural scientist, academic, and social entrepreneur based in Dublin, Ireland. Current and notable roles: former CEO of 4 Day Week Global, a global organisation advocating for and supporting adoption of the 4 Day working week through research, pilot programs, and organisational guidance. Assistant professor in human factors and psychology at Trinity College Dublin, lecturer in organisational behaviour at the UCD Michael Smurfit Graduate Business School, founder of 4 Day Work and Behavioural Doc, initiatives linking behavioural science to real world organisational design and wellbeing. Background and achievements: he holds a PhD in behavioural science, Trinity College Dublin, and began his career training as a psychologist before moving into behavioural science and organisational research. His work focuses on well-being, organizational behavior, and the future of work, especially how work time design like 4-day work week affects productivity, equity, and health. Recognized as a Time 100 most influential leader in health and a Forbes 30 under 30 honoree for social impact, his research and public work have been featured in major news outlets like The Atlantic, BBC, The New York Times, and Wall Street Journal. Perfect. I think that's everything. Let me know if I've missed something or.
Just one little small error, and it's that I actually originally trained as a physiotherapist, not a psychologist. So, but very easily, they start the same and they end the same in many ways. So, but I'm more of a psychologist than a physio these days, anyway.
Brilliant. Yeah, my bad. I think I just double checked there and it said physiotherapist. That's my fault. So excuse me.
All good. I don't embody physio's mind that much anymore. So.
Yeah, did you find that it was a big maybe go back to your the whole story, but do you find that was a big transition from physiotherapy to into behavioral science and
Yeah, I mean, I think when I was in secondary school, I was always really interested in the humanities, and but I also was not that bad at science, and I suppose there was a bias within secondary education that if you're smart, or certainly where I grew up anyway, if you're smart, you go into a profession. That is what you, and I was first generation to go to college, so going into a profession was seen as something quite secure, particularly after the 2008, recession. So I actually really wanted to study law, and I was discouraged by pretty much everyone because it was kind of the narrative that I don't know anyone in law, so the degree is going to be useless to me. And so I chose physio, and it was a degree which I found kind of interesting. I think it taught me a lot around the fundamentals of human physiology and anatomy and how to ultimately look after yourself holistically. But I self admit myself to be quite a shoddy physio. I wasn't motivated enough to pursue a career in it long term. So while I worked part time during my PhD as a physio in Tala Hospital, I became really intrigued by human psychology. And I often noticed that when I was working with patients, I was more interested in hearing their stories than actually trying to rehabilitate them. Um, and so my PhD was originally interested in following that curiosity of psychology, but then became more interested in organizational psychology because we spend about, if not at minimum, a third of our adult life in work. It is going to have a net positive or negative effect on our psychology. And in the context of my PhD, I was looking at sleep deprivation and fatigue in surgeons who spend well and above a third of their adult life in work. So I am quite fascinated by this kind of space of work and its relationship to us and what it means for us, which has been kind of the thread that has followed throughout my career, up until now.
yeah, super interesting. And I'd love to know, even growing up, even earlier, was it something you're in? Was physiotherapy something on top of your mind? Did you grow up in Dublin, if you don't mind me asking, or was it?
No, so I grew up in Kildare, in the countryside. I went to a very small rural school where there were six in my class, and then went from a class of six to a year of 120, and that was quite, a big shock to the system. Um, but I was always I was a high performing student. I did was quite academically privileged, and I tend to do quite well in a breadth of different disciplines. And I feel like then there was at that moment in time of higher ed or secondary education in Ireland, there was such like an argument against the arts and the humanities, or certainly it was where I was growing up, because there was essentially no jobs to be got from those degrees except for becoming a teacher, which is what my sister was. So I was also getting it from the family dynamic saying, do you want to be a teacher? No, well then don't do arts. Um, so I took, I suppose, another science that I was interested in. I was interested in biology more so than chemistry or physics. And physio seemed like a pretty palatable and acceptable career for me. My mother was diagnosed with MS when I was in sixth year as well. I'm sure that somewhat played a part with regards to me going into health sciences as well. Um, and yeah, I'm grateful for having done it. I think I've arrived exactly where I needed to arrive. I think if I'd gone and studied law earlier on, I'm sure I would have ended up burned out from the corporate structure and probably ended up in a similar space. So, uh, yeah, I don't look back on it with regret, I suppose.
Yeah, that's super interesting that some experiences earlier on in life kind of informed your studies and what you're kind of doing now. So that's super interesting. And I'd love to know the transition from when you were in primary school and then secondary school, you were a high performing academic student. When you were going to then third level into college, what were your thoughts? What were you thinking about, if you don't mind me asking?
I was thinking about having a good time. I'd spent so much of my time. I spent first to third year in a deaf school in Ireland, and I then went to a grind school for fifth and sixth year, and like really put my head down in grind school. I pretty much started school at 7:30 every morning and didn't finish until like 8 p.m. 5 days a week, and then Sunday or Saturday school from 9 to 4. So I did that pretty consistently for 2 years in a very highly controlled way, and I loved it. I thrived on it because and I took up new subjects. I took up French, and I really just enjoyed learning in that time. But then when I went to third level, I suppose I wanted to I wanted to find my tribe. I'd kind of been quite isolated throughout the entire grind school experience, and luckily I was able to live in a place called Trinity Hall in Dartry in Dublin, and I was 17 going to college, and I was in a household full of 17-year olds, so there was already some commonality there, which was great. And so I think I really enjoyed, yeah, year one, year two of college, just going out and having a bit of fun. But also big transition, having gone from being the big fish in a small pond to being the small fish in a big pond, and very humbling failing my first physiology exam 2 months into college, and then subsequently never being anywhere near the top in my undergraduate career, like constantly flirting the parameters of a 2.2 to a 2.1 degree. So that was quite stressful, I suppose, and made me think maybe this is not a career for me. Um, and I had thought at one point maybe about going into medicine, but I'm glad I didn't. I'm glad I went down the research route instead, because it ultimately brought me to learning how to love learning knowledge again, and learning knowledge that I inherently find interesting.
Yeah, that's great. I'd love to know if they're undergraduate as well. That was physio. What did you study in undergrad, if you don't mind asking, Dale? Was it just a
Physio,
physio?
physiotherapy.
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Excuse me.
yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I just want. I'd love to know then, after you finished your undergrad, what you went down the research route. Was that your decision to stay in Dublin, and you're thinking, okay, this is going to be my behavioral science? I'd love to know your thought process around that, if you don't mind sharing. And
Hmm. Well, I suppose in final year physio, knew I wanted to kind of get out of physio, and not necessarily very easy, because when you're trained in the professions like law or physio or medicine or pharmacy, they tend to be very like strict in what they expose you to. So I I couldn't just jump into a career in tech or in finance or in consulting or anything like that. I didn't have a skill set. So originally the PhD was my way of like giving myself some buffer to figure out what it is I wanted to do. And I wasn't a good researcher either. Like I consistently did quite poor as an undergraduate in research projects. Even though I thought I was doing all right, I didn't tend to get graded very well on them. So I went in with great trepidation and fear into my PhD, and really was thrown in at the deep end, and very much had to learn to sink or swim. So I had some quite dramatic, like, yeah, experiences early on. I skipped master's level, so I went from basically a degree that doesn't do much research into a full-time research career. And my supervisor was a clinician, so he was very time poor as well. So I had to figure a lot of it out by myself. Um, and I wish I knew now what I knew then. I wish I knew then what I know now, which is that there is no right or wrong way to do research, but you don't feel like that at that moment in time. You feel like there is these godly like academics who know everything. And now I am an academic full time, and I realize I know nothing. So, um, yeah, it's a lonely and quite transformative journey, I suppose, going to a research program like that.
Yeah, wow. It sounds like a big transition, big change.
Yeah, but I fundamentally enjoyed it, and I learned to love learning again. And I went from there. I didn't want to kind of stay in academia for like without going out into the real world for a little bit and seeing what's happening out there in industry. So I went and worked in Deloitte for 2 years in consulting there. And then I went and I joined 4 Day Week Global, which you spoke about, which was a not for profit organization, before kind of coming back then to Trinity as a assistant prof.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing all that. I really appreciate it. I'd love the when you mentioned about the when you finished, well, first of all, when you finished your research, we talked about behavioral science. Did you specialize in the 4 day, or is that a position that came up after your research?
Yeah, no, I was looking at what makes surgeons sleep deprived and fatigued. That was the fundamental question. And so I was working with a group of surgeons out of one of the large acute hospital settings in Ireland and doing kind of quantitative research, but also interviews and stuff like that on them as well. And I suppose the prevailing narrative was that surgeons are sleep deprived because they have long working hours, because there's not enough people in the system, because it's a very demanding career, etc. And so I began to understand from a behavioral science point of view, people are experiencing fatigue and sleep deprivation um, because they are working non-traditional hours, but also there's a culture that says you must learn to survive this system, and if you don't, you can't be a surgeon. And I think that I became much more interested in these sort of structural determinants of what can ultimately impact on performance more so than individual psychological traits. So there are naturally surgeons tend to be quite gritty people. They tend to be able to persevere despite the consequences, but the system could be better for them, and I'm sure performance of them and their well-being would be better then with that grit and a better system. So 4 Day Week kind of I there was a campaign happening in Ireland at the time where a few companies were experimenting with working time reduction at the same pay, and so I joined the steering committee of that pilot, ran at that time by a guy called Joe O'Connor, who's an Irishman as well. He used to work for Forsa, and I became really interested then in how do you change the system, so you reduce working hours, and then that creates this sort of ripple effect around how people reorganize work in order to maybe achieve the same but do so in less amount of time. And essentially what it meant was cutting out all of the bureaucracy and fluff that kind of creates huge strain on people and is not necessarily serving any purpose. And so I saw that and I thought this is a really interesting way to think about the future of work. And so eventually joined 4 Day Week Global, which was kind of the parent company of this Irish experiment. And we ran trials across every continent, looking at this fundamental idea of if you keep people at 100% pay, but we look to achieve their working hour reductions by 20%, and we're trying to achieve a same level of output or a same level of business viability or whatever it is, business growth. What changes? Like, how do leaders in organizations actually go about trying to achieve that? And there are so many ways, from all those different companies that I saw around the world, how they went about doing that. And some did it better than others, and some failed dramatically. And often culture dictates it. So if you had a very market driven economy like the US, they were much less receptive to this idea that actually a happier and healthier workforce could be more productive than, say, Europe or Australia, which has always had a culture of greater work life balance.
Yeah, that's yeah, fascinating. There's so many things you mentioned there that the surgeons are very gritty people and a lot of perseverance and sort of passion in their work. And which you mentioned the different markets, the US and Australia, and I'd love to know what the one big takeaway is, especially in a business context from the 4 day. If you don't mind sharing, I know it was your work, so I don't want to overstep, but I'd love to know like one big takeaway that maybe someone in maybe an SMB or even an organization could potentially apply to their company. You don't have to share it if it's yeah, but I'd love to know.
I do, yeah. I mean, I think what fundamentally differentiates people from being able to successfully embark on this more regenerative way of working, a more sustainable way of working. So to take a step back, sorry. So once I stepped away from 40-week global, which was, ultimately focused on just trying to get organizations to transition to working time reduction, and I saw these barriers that were stopping people from actually being able to experiment. And often it was coming down to this narrative of I don't have enough time, as it is. And, that is such a like barrier to actually having any sort of conversation then, because if you don't have enough time now and you don't do anything about it, you're going to even have less time in the future because of the pace of which, society is accelerating. So my career over the last year as an academic has been much more focused on trying to figure out what's missing within people's mindsets that actually allows them to even think about experimenting with working time or experimenting with different ways of working. And so I've emerged with this idea of temporal intelligence, which is how do we teach leaders to realize that not all time is created equally? And so, if you want to get innovation, for example, you need to create slack in the workday. There are particular behaviors and activities that allow people to have an increased ability to innovate. But if we treat every hour as the same, we're never going to innovate. Another way, for example, is realizing that not all time is created equally. So if you, as a member of maybe senior management, you tend to have a lot more autonomy over your time. You can cancel meetings, you can push back, you can delay, but that creates a ripple effect across your organization. For every delay you push on, you're creating more pressure down the system. So the analysts find themselves working till 7 or 8 because you haven't responded since 4 p.m. with an answer. So all of these sort of things are ultimately what I perceive to be creating the narrative of I don't have enough time. And it's because leaders don't see like time as something that's designable within a work context, and it's something that can be very intentionally designed. And so that's what I'm focusing on developing now, is training leaders to think slightly differently about this. I think that's what's going to differentiate, whether it's 4 day week or it's doing hybrid the right way, or whether it's 4.5 days, or whether it's, any alternative work pattern that's not the 9 to 5 work day. This form of intelligence, I think, is what's going to increase their likelihood of doing it properly.
Yeah, super interesting. Yeah, I really love the fact you said happier, healthy workforce as well, and yeah, there's that people can use so much more with their time and the temporal intelligence. If you don't mind, could you go into that just a bit more, Dale, about the intelligence side of things, about
Yeah.
how how a company could maybe apply that, or how they could maybe reach out to you or 4 day work week. I'd love to know.
Yeah. Well, first of all, with the idea of a healthier and happier workforce being more productive. Now, it's not just hyperbole. There's an emerging field called wellbeing economics that shows that when your workforce is less burned out, they tend to be more engaged, they tend to be more productive. And I mean, it doesn't take rocket science to to think that that's true, but the evidence is there to back it up now. The thing is that organizations really struggle to know how to actually keep their workforce happy and healthy, and that's because there's a discourse around what workplace well-being looks like, and it tends to focus on the wrong types of interventions that tend to focus on individuals' well-being, putting on yoga at lunchtime, providing them with benefits, providing them with health insurance. All these sort of things are good, but they aren't actually solving maybe the structural determinants that we know are causing burnout, which tend to be things like people not having control over their time, people feeling like work is not fair, people feeling like there's a lack of transparency around what good looks like, all of these sort of work factors. And leaders aren't focusing on these sort of things, and they don't have the skill set to do so. So temporal intelligence tries to shift that up shift the focus of the well-being intervention up to some of these more structural anchors. And I categorize it as there are individual traits which people can develop to become temporal leaders, which include temporal awareness. So actually being aware, having a level of what we call introspection, and being aware when actually we are working in alignment with our internal psychological and biological rhythms. So our brain, has a finite amount of working memory capacity. Our brain has, or our bodies have circadian and infradian rhythms. All these things influence how much attention we can give in any given moment. And so we should be curious about figuring out, are we working in alignment with those rhythms, or are we working out of kilter? So that's kind of step one. Once we figure out that awareness, then we can learn how to regulate within that. So we can figure out, do I need to push forward? Have I got the attention now to engage further, or do I need to take a step back and withdraw slightly from the context in which I'm operating in, which might be making me feel more tired or exhausted? So that's awareness, regulation. The third factor is what I call sovereignty, so temporal sovereignty. Oftentimes it can be quite difficult for people to simply just withdraw from a context. If work demands a lot of you, we can't just withdraw. So temporal sovereignty is actually teaching people the skills to be able to negotiate autonomy with the people who are constraining that autonomy in the first place. So it's actually a very applied kind of negotiation skill set. And then the last one is what I called temporal stewardship, which is that, and it alludes to that idea that I meant earlier on, that just because I gain a sense of agency over my time, I need to be conscious of not constricting the agency of other people, and so temporal stewardship is figuring out, how do I protect my own time, but also protect the time of the people around me, because that's ultimately the type of change that we're trying to create at the structural level. So they're all kind of the individual traits. And then I talk about 3 structural forms of intelligence, which leaders and organizations also need to develop, which is coordination. So actually, not just whether you have a good Gantt chart or project management stand-up process, but actually is the rhythm of the work actually in alignment with people and what people are capable of doing. Then temporal architecture, which aligns more with the ideas of the 4-day week. What are the actual policies and procedures of an organization that are more conducive to human biology and psychology, and getting them to work to the most optimal way? And then the last one is what I call temporal governance, which is, how do we ensure that we lock in these new ways of working longer term? Most interventions tend to fail because there isn't a governance structure overlooking it to make sure that if an intervention is happening, that it is producing the evidence benefit that is, needed. So that is kind of what temporal intelligence is currently looking like for me. And I, teach people that in several different ways, whether through training or through writing or whatever way makes sense for them.
Yeah, that's great. And do you find that you're dealing more with the individual or the business side of things at the moment?
I would say, in a way, like, you are, when you're dealing with the business, you are dealing with leaders who need to focus on developing their own individual. So, building individual forms of temporal intelligence is going to always be the first step, and it's whether, and leaders within an organization are the people who hold the disproportionate level of influence over the culture of an organization. So actually getting the CFO and the CEO and the CHRO all to realize the merit of this as a way of thinking, and to contextualize it in a way that makes sense for their own business needs, is what's actually going to lead to the bigger change across the organization longer term.
Excellent. Thanks, Mildale, for sharing that. I love the fact that it is the business, but the leaders are individuals in the organization that when they learn skills, everyone else may benefit. I don't want to put words in your mouth there, but it's something along those lines with behavioral science and psychology or behavioral science.
Yeah, I feel like we often forget that leaders are people. So, like, we often teach, um, we teach leaders as if they're agnostic to having thoughts and feelings themselves. But real good leadership is actually being able to teach them to apply whatever psychological principles in themselves first and understand it in a very embodied way before actually trying to influence that in the behaviors of others.
Yeah, do you notice there's a lot of pushback from individuals or leaders when they?
Not really, actually. I think I feel like, because it's all trying to achieve the same goal, which is ultimately figuring out a better way for people to work in a more humane and, time appropriate way. So whether it's 4-day week or it's temporal intelligence, they're all trying to achieve the same thing. And I feel like I've had greater success in being able to have heightened emotional conversations with people through the lens of temporal intelligence as opposed to suggesting something like a 4-day week, um, which I find, hugely hopeful because I think maybe this will be the driver actually to change longer term for us.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I've noticed maybe not the first person to mention this long-term sustainable change. It's very, I've seen it before from personal experience that people implement a habit or maybe even in a business context, people implement something within their company and to create long-term change or even medium-term to long-term versus short-term. Do you notice that it's a big issue or even with the 4-day work week or temporal intelligence, how to keep that sustainable or long-term?
Yeah, I think people have very simplistic views about human behavior, and like behavioral science is such a frustrating discipline to work in because what works in one context does not tend to work in another. So all you can really say in behavioral science is that there are general guiding principles around how change might be successful or how you might successfully go about creating a habit. But I think by and large, there are conditions which you can set up for success, and that will lead to an increased likelihood of the change becoming more embedded. But I think when trying to sustain change, one thing I think people often get fundamentally wrong in any sort of behavior change journey is that when faced with a setback, they tend to regress because regressing is comfortable. Regressing is their zone of safety as such, whereas they're constantly operating in this new unknown where maybe they don't know what the outcomes are. Whereas if something bad happens, they know they can go back to this and they'll feel comfortable and certain here. And that applies for how organizations operate behavior change at scale. And it also applies for individuals when they are trying to change any behavior, whether it's, trying to eat healthier or exercise more or whatever it may be, give up smoking or drinking or whatever.
Yeah, is there one thing maybe in the new year that individuals could implement if they find their setback at Christmas or something they could do to maybe not
I would
find?
say that I would say that the likelihood of your success of longer term behavior change is not whether are able to continuously engage in that behavior every day without fault, as much as it is if you do slip up, what are you doing in that moment? So are you treating this moment as feedback to say, I haven't fully figured this out yet, and I should be curious around why I slipped up today or tomorrow, and I didn't slip up any other days. That's feedback from which allows you to be curious about how to prevent this in the future, but also just be compassionate. I think if behavior change is being driven by a sense of frustration or guilt or shame, it does not work longer term. There is a reason why most like weight loss programs, like Weight Watchers and all these sort of things, don't work because they aren't driven by trying to change identity. That's ultimately how you change behavior long term, is people feeling fundamentally different in their inner world about themselves and what behaviors they engage in, not simply how many sins they have taken or what was the amount of calories that they consumed today compared to yesterday. So be and the only way, if you're constantly operating in a guilt and shame model in your behavior change journey, you're never going to allow your identity to be reconstructed. And so when you face these slip ups, as hard as it can be, like lean into compassion with yourself. Um, and you are much more likely then to get back on the track and do whatever it is that you're trying to do the day after, the day after.
But definitely compassion and self-compassion, one of those things where I don't know if you find that as an Irish, as a collective, you find it's a little trickier than others, or do you find other nations are a bit more compassionate, especially different workforces, or maybe different countries, excuse me.
Yeah, I would say collectivist based cultures tend to be a bit more compassionate. So society can be broadly categorized into two different types of cultures. You have us over here in the West, whereby we believe all of our success and failure tends to come down to our own individual pursuits. And that, creates a lot of individual based ideas about how success and failure looks like in the world, versus maybe those more in Eastern cultures realize that success often tends to come from the collective. So I I become a I become a as an example, sorry. So I become an assistant professor because I might think in the West because I you know, dug deep and I did this all myself, and it was through sheer determination and grit that I arrived where I am today. That's a very individualistic way of thinking about it. A collectivist way to say as well, I was fortunate enough for my dad to be able to work long hours to be able to put me through grind school, which meant that I was able to, actively engage in that education. Then I had a really strong support group throughout my college years, which helped me through difficult times, and all these sort of other people who ultimately bolster your sense of what helps you with your achievement. And so I think people are much more likely to, um, yeah, manage, you know, triumph and failure when they realize that nothing is achieved by just oneself. It tends to involve a lot of people.
Yeah, super interesting. The notion that it's not just oneself, but it's a number of people
Mm.
having, I suppose, being a bit. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Dale, but maybe being a bit grateful for those that have not but those that have maybe helped along the way to get to maybe where one's at today, or
Yeah, and I think actually Ireland is we're slightly unique in the Western ecosystem, I would say. Um, First of all, we're one of I don't know if we are the only, but we're certainly one of the only Western countries that never colonized. So we were colonized, and we were an indigenous group of people. We lived, you know, independent for long periods of any sort of empire or industrial way of thinking. And so we were quite collectivist as a group of people. And I think increasingly Irish culture has moved more towards individualism. There's that famous quote from Mary Harney back in the early 2000s that Ireland's economy is closer to Boston than Berlin. And I think it does reflect that idea that Ireland is very much influenced by American individualism and hustle. And I don't think it's good for us.
yeah, probably negative impacts, well-being, and as you mentioned, the term the happier and healthy workforce, and dealing with doctors and their fatigue and their burnout or their fatigue. And I'd love to know maybe if there's, and I suppose just 15 minutes or probably 5 minutes left. I'd love to know maybe two or three things. If there's a tech company out there, or let's say law or finance, and they would love to have a happier, healthy workforce, maybe what's one quick thing they could implement? I know the 4 day work week was maybe an example, or if you have examples of companies using that, it was just something they could implement that would really improve in the January in 2026. Is it?
I mean, I'll give you the honest answer, and then I'll give you the nicer answer. The way a lot of these companies are set up is to extract as much as possible. Like that is, the billable hour model in law is there to extract as much time out of people and to quantify it based off a numerical value. Like that is automatically in itself alienating people as a unit of capital. And we we need to be aware and have that sort of conversation as well. The same applies for tech, an increasing level of technological surveillance of the workforce. is automatically thwarting their sense of autonomy or innovation or creativity with their work. Um, and banking and finance, the ultimate goal is ultimately to raise money and revenue. And if that's all we are trying to achieve in work, we know the financial reward only builds people's happiness up to a point, but actually beyond a threshold, it can start to negatively impact their health and well-being. So more money as a means of rewarding people doesn't necessarily guarantee happiness for them. So there are some fundamental structural, things that underlie these industries, which are going to be difficult to actually transition them across to a fundamentally different way of operating. But I suppose the first space in which you could maybe start with having these more honest conversations would be to talk about the lens of time. And I think that it is an easy conversation for people to have because whether you're talking to the analyst or the CEO, everyone can relate to the idea of being time scarce. And so I think that is the foundation of conversation in order to design interventions that ultimately help people gain back a bit more time. Might be the most fruitful way for people to start next year.
Yeah, having conversations around it is the most probably important thing,
Yeah.
especially maybe some companies and or businesses or workplaces out there aren't even having uh, chatting about a healthier, happier workforce or how to become healthier, happier. Just mainly focus on maybe survival or hopefully not, hopefully money and as you mentioned, revenue or profit. Or,
And it's not an either or. Like I think I'm not a Luddite against like financial progress within a business, but I you can achieve it in a way that doesn't have to completely exhaust the most fundamentally important resource of your business. Now, anyway, at this moment in time, AI might change things in the future, which is your people. And if you are constantly extracting and exhausting that workforce, you actually are never fully realizing the potential of what they could achieve. And so we often think about, well, I can't invest in this because this will cost us money. But actually, there's a cost by not doing it, which we aren't quantifying when we're having these sort of conversations. And that might help shift the conversation slightly.
yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Phil. I appreciate that. Conversations is a great way to gain awareness about having a workforce that's yeah in the long term. I think you mentioned there that it's almost you can actually make more money or be more productive with if people have conversations around health and happiness and uh, in the workplace. But yeah, brilliant. I'd love to know if there's one piece of advice you'd go back and maybe someone out there is aspiring to maybe study behavioral science, do a PhD, or maybe be a CEO. I'd love to know, is there any word of wisdom you'd give them or to your younger self, or maybe just,
Well, if they're looking to study behavioral science, it's very hard to do so in Ireland. There currently is no undergraduate or there's no undergraduate programs that study behavioral science. There is now a master's program which I think is starting in DCU. So I think that could be really transformative for building behavioral science as a discipline in Ireland. And I think one thing that I think has been the biggest learning for me over my career today has been putting myself in situations which I have felt very uncomfortable in. And the minute I start feeling comfortable, I move to somewhere else. And, that having gone from physio to, a PhD researcher to working in the big four to leading 4 Day Week Global to being now an assistant prof, like you can see my career, it has jumped and lily padded across the place. Um, but there has been so much learning from being in that space of being uncomfortable, and we're kind of, as a society, pushed towards comfort a lot these days, and it's not where we grow, you know.
yeah, I love that point, Jill, especially coming into January for anyone that find themselves maybe in a comfortable position and to find that place where they, yeah, to push for, so I don't push for being uncomfortable and constantly
Hmm.
find discomfort to grow. And yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Emil.
And it becomes easier. The more you become uncomfortable, the more comfortable being uncomfortable becomes.
If you, and can you give a quick example if you wouldn't mind sharing, or is there?
I mean, when I was 4-day week CEO, I got invited to speak at the Wall Street Journal CEO Summit in London, which was a totally baffling experience. Before me was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, like up on stage before me. I was thinking, what the fuck am I doing here? Um, and I was in a room, of like very, very wealthy, like London CEO, typically men. Um, but I'd been in so many uncomfortable positions over the years before that, like having spoken to people on Wall Street and being kind of laughed out of the room and all of these sort of things, that I just kind of realized, well, I'm here now. I'm here for a reason. They've obviously invited me for a reason. The imposter might be there, but doesn't mean I have to listen to it. And so I think the more one exposes themselves to uncomfortable situations, even those big, big, scary things, they become less serious, because you realize no one really knows what they're doing. Um, and we're all just here trying to figure it out all the time.
Yeah, that's a lovely point to finish on, and really appreciate you coming on, Dale. Is there somewhere can people find you, just not just but through LinkedIn or
Yeah,
email, or if they want to maybe get you to speak or
yeah, they can check out LinkedIn, or yeah, they can check out my research on Trinity's website, and if they're ever interested in anything to do with well-being in the workplace, I'd love to have a conversation with them.
brilliant. Thanks again, Dale, for coming on and appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks, Ryan.
No worries. Merry Christmas and enjoy the West or Cork
You.
and
You too.
perfect. Thanks, Dale.
See you.
See you. Bye bye.